Right, good evening everybody and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. A couple of bits of housekeeping. First, I think everybody in the room knows where the toilets are and knows that we're not expecting a fire alarm, but if you could just remember to turn off your mobile phones for the duration of the meeting, please. I'm relieved and pleased to say we have no substitutions this evening, so we can move straight on to the main agenda, which is item 1, declarations of interest. Does anybody have anything they wish to declare in relation to this evening's meeting? No, thank you. Okay, on to item 2, which is the minutes of the last meeting. I just have one amendment that I would like to make in the first paragraph. So the first paragraph, there's just a couple of bits of wording which I think doesn't quite reflect the situation. So I would like to change the first paragraph to read, "The chair of the committee raised concerns about the use of substitutes on the committee, which gave the Liberal Democrat Party a majority at the meeting. The chair of the committee believed the makeup of the committee was contrary to the spirit and purpose of the legislation relating to proportionality, as it did not reflect the political makeup of the council. The chair of the committee took an adjournment to discuss the makeup of the committee." The next 2 paragraphs I'm comfortable with, although there is one point of clarity I'll just pick up once we've voted on the minutes. And then obviously I left the meeting after the adjournment, so Councillor Pearson and the other members who remained in the meeting, if you're happy that the rest of the meeting, the minutes are an accurate record. Councillor Pearson, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think at the end of the first paragraph, I've got a couple of amendments which I've got in writing, which I would forward to the Democracy Officer, if that's okay, if agreeable. At the end of the first paragraph, it would just be to say, against the wishes of several councillors. In the second paragraph, changing...
Sorry, just one moment. If you could just say exactly where.
At the very end, so the chair of the committee took an adjournment to discuss the makeup of the committee against the wishes of several councillors.
Fine.
In the second paragraph, the first sentence, council's legal position, to change that for outlined the external legal advice received from Bevan Britton to provide an independent overview of the council's position. This advice explains that a seat at the committee was allocated and approved by full council. And then at the end of that sentence, after Green Party used their approved substitute, instead of "it was confirmed that any member of City of York Council could substitute for another member," to say "it was confirmed that it is lawful in any seat allocated to a political group for that group to appoint any member of the council as a substitute, regardless of that member's political group membership."
I'm afraid I don't think we can accept that, because I don't think that that is a defensible position.
Okay, let's perhaps leave that to the committee to decide. At the end of the paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, after the note of the vote, I was going to say I obviously noted my disappointment with the chair's actions, particularly the items being discussed at the meeting were particularly important that evening, which I obviously noted. And that would be the end of my proposed amendments.
Okay, so with 2 sets of amendments, I suggest that the simplest thing would be to defer to the chair and vice chair to agree the amendments of the minutes, and then it's up to committee either to delegate responsibility to the pair of us to sign them off, or to bring them back to the next meeting amended for a final sign-off. I'm happy with either of those 2 options. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just suggest that you and the Vice Chair agree wording of that minute and then bring it back to the next meeting for approval?
Everybody happy with that? If you could just give us a nod. Okay, so Councillor Pearson, if you could share your suggested amendments, I will share my suggested amendments, and Councillor Fenton, if you and I could get together at some point before the next meeting just to agree what we're saying, that would be excellent.
Chair, sorry, can I just ask that they're also any proposed amendments are sent to Democratic Services?
Sorry, that was
who you're meaning? Right,
sorry, did I not make that clear? Apologies. The one other thing I wanted to just clarify on the minutes is that they suggest that the appointment of members and selected substitutes matters that are reserved to full council. Now, it's my understanding that actually the allocation is full council and the appointments can be changed through staffing matters and urgency. Now, that may be under delegation from full council, but I would just like to be clear about that.
So there is authority from full council for appointments to be changed in between each meeting of full council, but they are taken to full council for full information. So it's not as if they do it in isolation. They do report fully to full council in terms of all of the changes that we've been asked to make. So they are reported there. So it's not in isolation, but it's the changes that are done are also in consultation largely with group leaders as well. So it's kind of not a surprise, I think, is what I'm trying to say. It's an informed decision that goes to SMU, and obviously we're made aware of it. In the Constitution, there is an authority as well that we accord with the wishes of the political group leaders, and that is the role and responsibility that SMU has in this instance. Alternatively, all changes and appointments, there are two alternatives. One is that all changes are made by the monitoring officer or the head of paid service. And the other option is that all changes are made solely by full council, and then the changes have to wait for each full council meeting before they're approved. All those methodologies operate in councils up and down the land. So there is no one fixed view. There are alternatives that can be chosen by councils.
So for clarity, it's been custom and practice in York that appointments to committee memberships and substitutions have generally been changed via SMU and then reported back to full council. That's correct, isn't it?
It's not custom and practice. It's actually written into the terms of reference for the SMU committee. It's in the Constitution.
Yeah, but that's
so that procedural action is actually written into the Constitution currently in the terms of reference. That's one of the specific functions it has. And it's very clear that SMU carries out the functions on behalf of full council.
So I think that the wording where it suggests that such matters are reserved to full council is not quite a reflection of what this situation is in terms of the way that we.
So I think if just to quantify the advice that I gave, the advice is that members of this committee cannot unilaterally alter its membership. So there is no way that the members here can vote to change their own membership. That is a decision which is outside of the remit of this committee. The decision as to who is appointed to this committee rests with SMU for the interim changes which are made in between full council, and the actual ultimate authority rests with full council.
Thank you. And just as a point of clarity, and apologies for labouring this point, there's no obligation for any member to send a substitute when they're not able to attend the meeting, is there?
Chair, I don't think it's appropriate for me to ask that. I think the matter around substitutions has already been dealt with by full council. It's already been dealt with at previous meetings of this. There's no substitutions present here today.
No, I understand. It's just for members' awareness. Just to be clear, there isn't an obligation either under any of the legislation that governs the committees or under the Constitution to send a substitute when you are unable to attend the committee.
The council operates quite an open attitude towards substitutions, unlike other councils where I've worked. Some councils have a zero tolerance of any substitutes at all meetings, and so therefore an apology is taken as an apology and that place remains vacant at a meeting. This council is very specific in terms of openly accepting positions of substitutes, and annual council does confirm the appointment of substitutes for members of this committee, other scrutiny committees, in fact all other committees as well. And that's all I'm prepared to say on this matter.
Okay, my understanding is that there is no obligation to send a substitute if you are unable to attend the committee. I think one final point of clarification I would just like to double check while we're here. We might as well get it all over and done with. Named substitutes on committees. We haven't previously operated with only the named substitutes being able to attend committees. That's something which I believe changed last year following an audit and governance change. And I believe that audit and governance has now requested that that change be removed. So going forward, assuming that full council accepts that change from audit and governance, will there be a requirement to only send the named substitute on this committee or any other committees? Or will it be in the gift of the appointed member to send any substitute from any member of any political group, as you've said is possible to do?
Chair, the position around named substitutes is actually slightly more complicated than you set out. The Council's constitution is very clear that for certain committees, named substitutes are applicable. What full council is going to be asked to consider at the request of Audit and Governance Committee is actually a very, very stringent restriction, which does not allow for discretion of groups when they've exhausted their list of named substitutes to send an alternative substitute to the meeting. In March 2020, Audit and Governance Committee made a recommendation to full council prior to being completely aware of the implications of the lockdown. The planning committee, along with one other committee, which as I'm talking now, I cannot remember, but I think it was Joint Standards Committee, put a restriction on when you've exhausted all of your named substitutes, you are no longer allowed to write to the monitoring officer and the chief executive, as was now the chief operating officer, to suggest an alternative substitute to go to that meeting. During lockdown, that's caused considerable difficulties for every group, actually, in terms of the planning committee. Planning committee has been the most deeply affected by that because there's been occasions due to either illness, restrictions of lockdown, restrictions of isolation, which has meant that that committee has become close to being to its quoracy levels, which is deeming slightly uncomfortable when we get to that point. The restriction that is being lifted, or hopefully at full council, is that we go back to the position where when you've exhausted your named substitutes at planning committee and joint standards committee at this moment in time, you can write to the chief operating officer and the monitoring officer suggesting another suitable substitute. Now for planning, you have to be trained. Obviously, any substitute has to have received training. So that is a restriction still, but it should facilitate the attendance at planning committee and ensure it remains quorate on a much more frequent basis.
So just for the clarity, what's the implication for this committee then?
So for this committee, there are substitutes who are appointed at annual council, and that is done and has been approved at annual council. So there are different rules in place. So the current changes which full council are asked to being amended only relate to the planning committee and no other, because the only instructions that I've received relate to planning committee attendance. I've not received anything else, and that I understand is with the support of all groups who've all faced difficulties in attending planning.
So again, I'm sorry, but I'm not quite getting to the answer that I'm looking for in clarity. Are you saying that it would be permissible for somebody to send a substitute to this committee that wasn't on the named substitute list if the named substitute was not available? Or are you saying that only the named substitutes can attend this committee?
Chair, I think I've answered your question. Annual council approves substitutes who attend this committee. They did that on the 27th of May. Those substitutes are freely able to attend this committee in the absence of a member of this committee. Full council is being asked to consider the substitute position for planning committee due to very different circumstances. I think the use of substitutes for this committee, and I think the constitution is clear and sets out, and the appointments are made by annual council, and I'm satisfied that the appointments have been appropriately made.
I'm just looking for a straightforward answer, but it feels like it's not forthcoming, and I don't quite understand why, but I'm not going to continue. I think we've had enough discussion of that. I will move us on to agenda item 3, which is public participation. We have one person registered to speak, which is Gwen Swinburne, who is here to speak on the general remit of the committee, and I think particularly strategic scrutiny function and the management structure. So Gwen, you'll be very well versed in the public participation procedures in the council. You've got your 3 minutes, off you go.
Thank you. Members, when Councillor Crawshaw was first given the privilege of this chair in 2019, I approached him twice to discuss systemic scrutiny failures. He made clear in this place on camera that anything I had to say would need to be said here, so here goes. The state of scrutiny under his leadership has, from a low base, since become an embarrassment. The drifting into secrecy of the so-called scrutiny forums simply treats our democracy as a private club. How can this even be legal? But members, this is just the top of the iceberg. I checked the fag packet work plan. You have yet again abrogated your responsibilities and declined to scrutinize the proposed budget for next year. Other authorities scrutinize sometimes for days, but you, nothing, again. Now we have also the 800-page constitution refashioned by the monitoring officer with no promised engagement with members. So now another private club of members are expected to go through in a few short weeks. This is the defining document that dictates all our governance, yet silence again from this committee. You should be demanding a review of the audit and governance agreed draft. You should be demanding public consultation and a complete proper equalities impact assessment. A delay to March Council will enable a proper process. Third, I am staggered to see no scrutiny of the Council's response to COVID, nor its approach to return to desks. Surely these are overriding scrutiny matters. Finally, members, we have witnessed over the last 3 years, since January 2020, particularly the implosion of democratic services. It has not been fit for any purpose for a long time, with repeated breaches of laws and codes. You all know this, yet you have not commissioned a scrutiny nor required an external review. Members, by your inaction, you are contributing to the failures in this council. The longer you avoid addressing these fundamental check and balance failures, the worse things will get. Finally, may I ask you, Chair, if a member of this committee in future cannot attend and they nominate a different party to represent them, will you storm out again? Will you be paying back your SRA for your actions? Will you apologise to this committee, citizens and the monitoring officer for your poor behaviour? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your time this evening, Ms Swinburne. I'm sure that myself and all committee members will take into account your thoughts, and I can't find another word, but you know where I'm coming from. Right, move us on to agenda item 4, which is the annual complaints report, and we are joined at the table by Kath Murray, who is complaints and feedback manager with a very helpful sign, so I don't have to remember it, and Lorraine Lunt, who is information governance and feedback team manager. Apologies for making you wait, but if you could just talk us through your report and the annex, and then I'll go over to members for questions.
Good evening, Chair and Committee. This is the annual complaints report that by law we have to present to yourself and to Audit and Governance after this committee around adults and children's social care complaints. 2 or 3 years ago, we added in the corporate complaints information so that you have an overview of the performance for that full year. And that includes reference to the Ombudsman's annual letter and the different performance and number of complaints and other information on remedies around the corporate complaints received in that particular year. Points to note from the annual report and the local government social care ombudsman's annual letter and the published performance for this council in that reporting year are that 63% of all the detailed investigations that were undertaken by the ombudsman were upheld. This means that in 63% of the cases where the ombudsman investigated in a full detailed manner, they found against the council and upheld the complainant's complaint. However, when you compare that to all cases that the ombudsman took on, that does fall to 27%. In 100% of the cases, the ombudsman was satisfied that we did successfully implement their recommendations, and that compares to 99% in other similar local authorities. One of the more interesting pieces of information from the annual letter is to show and to highlight that in at least 17% of the cases where the Ombudsman upheld the case, we had already put in place a satisfactory remedy in those cases. And that compares to an average of 10% in similar authorities across England and Wales. The main theme from the 3 complaints procedures, so that's adult social care, children's social care and the corporate complaints process, was issues with the quality of the communications and or the responses going back out to complainants. We're continuing to work with the service areas and looking at how we improve that and sustain that improvement going forward. And under the children's social care procedure, in the preceding year, it reduced from 91 to 55. In adults, there was a reduction again in the number of complaints received through that social care complaints procedure. For complaints received under stage 1 of the previous old corporate complaints procedure, what you will be aware is that in April this year, following committee's approval, we implemented a new 4 C's approach to complaints, compliments, concerns, comments. I always forget one, and no matter which order I say them in. And what that was from learning through the start of the lockdown on the team, the corporate governance team, taking control at an earlier stage of where we started to receive contacts from customers that were having an issue or needed some support. So what that then shows is that there was a reduction in the number of complaints received. However, you will see that there was a considerable amount more comments logged under the old procedure. And that again is just to reiterate, was that by the corporate governance team intervening earlier in the process to ensure that we could resolve where possible the issues that an individual, a resident, was having in an earlier stage before it escalated into a complaint. There was also improvements made in the percentage of responses in time across all 3 stages in the corporate complaints procedure from the previous year. As you're aware, the corporate governance team is also responsible for the provision of information governance services, and the performance reports for those areas are included in the regular reports to Audit and Governance Committee and in the annual monitoring officer report and also the annual governance statement. So that's a whistle-stop tour of a very long document and a very detailed document. I'm happy to take questions. I do have Kath here as the author of the report and the more detailed report, so open to any questions.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do, because to my mind, this report sort of comes in 4 parts. There's the kind of cover report, then there's all of the stuff around children's, all the stuff around adults, and all the stuff around corporate. So I think if we could take it in each of those 4 stages. So I'll just ask committee members if you have any questions on the general sort of over report, first of all. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Kath and Lorraine, for your report. Paragraph 7 on page 10 refers to some contingency arrangements that were put in place at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. Could you just go into what those were, please?
So what we did was we worked with several service areas, including the adults and children's social care departments. And rather than just log and pass on for investigation and or response and or an investigation into a service area that was either diverting resources into other provisions around the response and recovery from COVID-19, we took on those tasks and early into investigations and interventions. We also did that alongside some of the waste services and worked with them closely so that we could do those intervention and investigations and responses in a more timely manner.
Not seeing any other hands. I've just got one question on also on page 10, just on paragraph 5 and 6. And in both instances, both in children's and adults, I think the overall number of complaints dropped, which obviously on the face of it looks great. I'm just wondering if there was any correlation between were more people accessing those services, because obviously COVID, it's been such a strange year, it must be quite difficult to draw inference out of sort of year-on-year reports. Did that drop in complaints correlate either positively or negatively with a drop in or a rise in people using services? Could it be even better than we thought if loads more people were using the service?
So what I think the correlation is that there was a drop in people contacting the council. They may very well have had other things to be dealing with and addressing. However, what we will be looking at in the next this quarter and next quarter that are in the more detailed reports to Audit and Governance, because they get a quarterly report, is where that case increase is going back up, so people are starting to come back. It's about also making sure that the ability to make a complaint or raise a concern is made as accessible as possible to all members of the community and residents, and how we learn from previous investigations where there may have been a difficulty for an individual to access complaints or make a complaint, how we make those improvements as well going forward. So there's a bit more work to do on the analysis of the figures from this past year, but also looking at what's happening with the quarter 1, 2 going forward in this year with the new 4Cs approach as well.
Thank you. Councillor Hook, I think I saw your hand next, and then Councillor Norman after that.
Thank you, Chair. One of the lovely things about this report is that all through it, you list the compliments that we've received, which is really good. And I just wondered if there was any procedure to let the staff who've done this excellent service that's got a compliment to be recognised, especially because it's been such an awful year.
So we do have several internal ways of ensuring that the compliments are passed on. One of the biggest issues that we have is getting actually staff to recognise and send us through the compliments so that we can log them and make sure that that information is presented in these types of reports. When Kath and or myself go to the Directorate Management teams, we do that reminder on how to spot a compliment and or pass it through the process. The information is also on the Outlook email system, where you can send an email that copies in both the comms team and hopefully what I'm going to ask is that's copied into our Have Your Say mailbox so that we can see sight of those as well. So there are lots of different methods and ways that we can make sure that compliments are both raised and logged and put through the process. But that important back of feeding back to staff and individuals and making them aware of where we have had that contact from a resident or a customer to say that something has gone well, that we make sure that that gets back to the person if they haven't already been told. We also have and Kath knows this process a bit better than me, a staff commendation scheme that where that's nominated either from residents, customers and or a member of staff, and then that process is put through to our Chief Operating Officer, and then the staff commendation will go on their personnel file.
Okay, I've got Councillor Norman next, and then Councillor Baker.
Councillor Baker was before me. If you want to go first, please feel free.
No, I wasn't. It's fine. You go.
I do apologise. Okay then. Just sort of following on, I think partially from Councillor Corshaw's point. I think it's really important that we talk about context, because a low or a high rate of complaints is not necessarily an indicator of that the symptom is necessarily what would be assumed. I wonder, you talk about other contextualizers from local authorities. Do we have any information as to if they've experienced similar trends in the numbers of complaints received at the moment?
So Kath attends as part of our designated complaints officer role, what's called a link network of complaints managers with the ombudsman usually in presence and or the assistant ombudsman in presence. And what happens there is there's obviously shared learning, looking at themes and or if there's improvements that some areas have made or some local authorities have made that we can all learn from and start to look to implement here in York. The information around benchmarking or comparative data. This information in paragraphs 5 and 6 on the covering report is actually from the local government ombudsman, social care ombudsman's website, who does the performance stats year on year on each of the local authorities and puts that information up. There is some benchmarking comparative data on the City of York Council's page, if you like, on that page. What we are also looking at, and Kath will correct me if I'm wrong, is looking at, there's a adult social care managers group in the region that meets as well, and they obviously look at adult social care complaints, and it's about agreement with those different local authorities about publishing the information that they share there as well. So hopefully going forward, there will be more comparative data on the other stuff that isn't on the Ombudsman's website.
Thank you. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So thanks for the report. It won't surprise you to know that members receive a huge number of concerns, comments and requests into our inboxes all the time. So it just occurred to me that I don't know whether you are logging things that come through member inquiries inbox. And if not, is there some way that we as members can feed in even more concerns and requests and complaints to you? Would we just overload you, or is this an area that is actually being missed? And there's also, I would suggest to residents sometimes to email ycc@york.gov.uk. So there's that one, and have your say, and member inquiries, and we could give you loads more.
So we work very closely with their customer services team because they manage that members inquiries portal and service, where they identify that it's a complaint and fits that definition, because there is if it's just the definition of a complaint for the purposes of the corporate policy is it can't be the first time we're hearing of something, because we have to have an opportunity to put it right. So for example, you've missed my bin this week and I want you to come back and collect it. That wouldn't be log, even if the customer says it's a complaint, we will still respond to it, but we won't log it as a complaint for when it's the first time that we're hearing of a service that's been missed. If when they've been told that we'll come back out for that missed bin or that missed service and it's missed again, then it will escalate through the complaints process, and the complaints advisors would then do the investigation into the service area, what's went wrong for that customer. So the customer services team, where they identify that it needs to come through to our process, will pass on anything out of members' inquiries into Have Your Say. If you are emailing the ycc@york.gov.uk mailbox and you believe it is a complaint, I would ask you nicely, if you can please send it to haveyoursay@york.gov.uk. There is also an online complaints and feedback form on the website, if that's easier to either let the customer themselves access that information and fill that in themselves, or if you want to help support them or advocate for them in that way, to fill that in, and that drops straight into our inbox.
Quickly, the compliments, we could feed in compliments if you want us to.
Yes, please. If you do get any compliments, please send them into haveyoursay@york.gov.uk.
Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. On page 20, so the preamble to the to the report.
Just hang on one second. If we're going on to page 20, are we all ready to move into children's services and what have you? Because I'm quite happy to take us there, but I think that's where...
I don't think so. Children's services starts on page 21, so we're still in the... I think we're still in the general.
I do apologise. I do apologise. There's a preamble to the preamble. Yeah, go for it.
There's in the final paragraph on page 20, there's a reference to work with the agency and managers to better understand and manage these costs. I just wanted to check which agency is being referred to. Is there an agency that provides the independent people that is part of stage 3, I think it is?
Yes, you're correct. We have to go out to procurement at the correct contractual time to procure and tender and contract with an independent agency that provides both independent people and or independent investigators at various stages throughout the certain parts of the complaints processes. There has been an increase in the spend in that area over the last 2 or 3 years, but that's the rising nature of the complexity of the cases being investigated through that process. So yes, you're right. It's a company by the name of Choices and Voices Limited that we currently have a contract with.
Okay, I think we can now get to, sorry, my apologies. I got in my head page 20 was where the children started, but from page 21, it's children's social care. So if members have any questions about that particular area, Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your report. And sometimes with these reports, it's easy to get lost in numbers and explanations that you give us, even trying to read through the report. So there's a table at the top of page 21, that talks about the complaints received, recorded, and you may well have alluded to this in your preamble, but 2019-2020 there appeared 22, which is the same as 18-19, but 2021 that jumped to 59. That's a huge jump. And then I noticed further down you talk about the concerns and comments that had been received, and that was actually down on last year. So I was thinking that maybe the jump might have something to do with COVID or the contact centre, but then the next tab of figures doesn't support that. So can you just give us a little bit of an understanding around why we've gone from 22 in 2019-20 to 59 in 2021?
So the table at the top of page 21 or just near the top is around the compliments received, and I believe that will be the work that the increase that's shown on that table from 1920 into 2021 is from the work that the team did across the different service areas across the council to ensure that they did send on the compliments when they were received. I'm sure that's still not the total number of compliments received for the whole of the council for a whole year, but it is starting to pull the information in through this corporate annual report. But that's the thinking behind why that increases. It's the awareness that we raise with staff on sending those through. The decrease, however, in concerns, comments and requests will be, again, just potentially, because the reporting period was, if I remember my years right, the reporting period was from the start of the first lockdown. And so I wouldn't have suspected that there would have been a huge decrease at that point in time because we were just entering the first lockdown. It's only a small decrease, but I could, and Kath will intervene for me here if there's any other points that she wants to make from her report and the analysis that she did.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's the reason for the increase in compliments. We've worked quite hard to make sure that we are receiving those and that they are getting reported back to yourselves and to the people in the service areas. In terms of the comments, again, I would agree with what Lorraine said. I think it's a fairly small reduction from previous years, or certainly from the year before. They do tend to go up and down a little bit. And I think it will be, what we need to see is whether that was kind of a theme that continued for a number of years, or whether it does kind of go up and down as we would expect it to.
Okay, I'm looking for any further questions. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Just on page 31, I just wanted to check my understanding of the gender table at the top of page 31. In 2 years, there seems to be a sudden increase in the number of respondents that chose not to answer that question, but that they appear to be the sum of the numbers above. So I just wondered whether it was an inadvertent total of those numbers above, or whether it's genuinely in 2021, 55 people didn't state or didn't want to state their whichever the gender options were available.
What I'll do is I'll go back and look at the calculation on that row of the table just to make sure, because it is rather coincidental if it is. But yes, thank you. I will pick that up and I'll email background. Sorry, I switched it off too early. And if I email the answer and response background, I'll committee members via chair, if that's okay.
Thank you. I just had one question on this section, which was on page 26. In the table at the bottom, I think inappropriate action and lack of action is a common theme that seems to be a kind of category that's often the highest in terms of complaints throughout. But just on the quality of advice and communication, now obviously the numbers are really small, but there seems to have been quite a big jump between 2019 and 20 and 2020, 21. And I'm wondering if you got any more detail about, because obviously quality of advice, a complaint about that could be quite different than a complaint about general communication of the advice. And I presume that you do dig deeper into that, but also in terms of reporting, would there be any benefit to actually having, because if everything's about just poor communication, that's not great, but it's not the end of the world. If the advice is poor, then that obviously could be really quite serious in whether it's children's or adults, but particularly where we're dealing with potentially vulnerable people.
Yeah, so I think just on the explanation after there, I think we were saying we feel that as a team we've done a lot more exactly of what you're saying we should be doing there, and digging a little bit deeper into that and being able to understand that difference. So I think that's why it's gone up this year, and I suspect what we want to see is whether again there's a theme around that. So what we've kind of tried to pull out of there and make a differentiation between is it kind of a lack of response, a lack of getting back to people, or is it when somebody's got back, the advice, the information that they've provided hasn't been clear, or it's been somebody's felt it was misleading. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be upheld and agreed with, but we're trying to work out exactly what somebody's saying to us so that we can give them a better answer and give them better information.
Thank you. And I guess the sort of follow-on question from that is obviously these categories are, I think, common throughout. Are these categories that we select as a council, or are these the Ombudsman or whoever the reporting body is?
Yeah, they're pretty much set nationally. There's some little bits that we can do within there and we can add into them. But generally speaking, this is how it's reported. There's an obligation for us to do an annual report for both adults and children's social care, and they want these themes in there so that again that can be seen kind of nationally as well.
Thank you. Councillor Norman, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Just on this as well, it strikes me that although these categories might seem clear and useful, you could quite well have quite significant overlap in some of them. And I have to say, I'm slightly surprised as somebody who, in a different role, has eyes on some complaints in a public capacity. I'm surprised that disagreeing with policy is so low. I would generally expect, in terms of complaints about a public service, complaints in policy to be quite a high one. And it would strike me that inappropriate action could overcross with that, or lack of action could overcross with that, or yeah, quite a, I'm not sure where I see the dividing lines coming in, and I'm assuming you decide that, but yeah, I'd be interested to hear kind of more on that really.
So I think sometimes, you do have to make a judgment on things, but I mean, this part of the report is particularly about children's social care. And I do think a lot of the complaints that we get are actually about potentially whether somebody has got back and explained something, whether somebody's kept somebody up to date. Generally speaking, people aren't saying, I understand what the policy is, but I disagree with it. They're just sometimes confused about it because they haven't had those kind of responses. So I think particularly for children, that tends to be what it is. But I think it is certainly something that we need to keep an eye on and make sure we are understanding clearly what our complainants are saying.
Okay, I'll move us on then to the adult social care section, which is page 34 through to page 44. And again, just invite any members with questions on that section. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, it applies to this, but I suppose it also applies to the other sections. But I was just wondering around, of those complaints that are upheld, can you just explain in sort of layman's terms what is the lessons learned, sort of feedback loop, and how, if we've done something wrong, we want to do it better in future, how that then gets embedded into sort of genuine procedure and practice going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, again, we're trying to pick up a little bit around how the Ombudsman is doing that, because what the Ombudsman is doing much more of in the last sort of 2-3 years, and again, they've told us they're going to be doing even more of, is when they make recommendations and that's been agreed, they want the evidence of that. So we have to chase managers and say, you need to send that evidence to us so we can send it to the Ombudsman. So that's something that we are trying to do a lot more of ourselves, and be able to say to managers, this is what has been agreed, you know, and make sure, and again, kind of what we're doing with the advisors is saying it needs to be something that's measurable. We need to be able to see that that has actually happened and be able to look at whether that has had an impact on the services and the number of complaints coming in about that. So that's really what we're doing at the moment, is trying to work to get that evidence back in to make sure that the learning has happened.
And also just on that, there's the section later on in the report on each three sections about the lessons learned and the themes, and how we try to do that continuous improvement cycle of understanding what the complaints themes are coming in, where we can make improvements, not just waiting on the Ombudsman making a recommendation for a remedy, but looking at the earlier stages within the investigations done by the team on where we're starting to see similar, same, recurrent types of concerns and complaints being raised. Kath works closely with each of the directorate management teams and goes to regular meetings to talk through those more frequent regular reports to those teams and how they can use the lessons learned or the recommendations either made from the investigations by the team or from the Ombudsman on ensuring that that stops happening where we can make that difference. So there is that continuous learning and feedback loop, as it used to be called. You get a complaint, you learn your lesson, you look at it and then look to see how that can be improved. We also don't work in silos stroke compartments with the directorate management teams and the service managers, where we have, say, a recommendation from an investigation in children's social care, but we can see that it's a theme within a different service area. We share that learning across the council, and we also take regular reports both to the Governance Risk Assurance Group and also the CMT.
Just one further point that I would make on that, as well as one of the things that we would like to see happen more and more, is that the Ombudsman is telling us that actually, even if they're agreeing that a complaint was upheld, they feel that it's already been remedied before it got to them. So we've seen an increase of that, as Lorraine was saying, in this year, and that's something I'd like to see continue.
Okay, I've just got one question myself on this section, which is on page 38, and I'm not quite sure. Well, you'll have to bear with me as I try to articulate this. The table at paragraph 29 there, in looking between 2019-20 and 2020-21, that 2019-20 total figure seems to be a bit of an outlier. It's pretty much double this year's and the year previously. And if you look at the upheld and partly upheld on those 2 years, they broadly go up 50%, down 50%, whichever way you're looking. But then the not upheld, not proved, not pursued, no response in 2019-20 is all quite significantly higher. So what it means as a proportion is that of the complaints received in 2020-21, about 50% were upheld or partly upheld, whereas in the previous year, it's a much lower proportion. And that just seemed a bit odd. I don't know whether you've spotted that and had a look at that and whether there's any sort of explanation behind that.
I think, again, it's something we'll have to see in terms of themes, but I think certainly what I feel has happened here is, again, it's the impact of COVID, and that what that has meant is that as a team, we have been able to work much more closely at an early stage with complaints. And that's something that managers have agreed will continue. So we've actually been getting involved with supporting managers much more closely since COVID, having a look at complaints. And there's been times that we've thought, actually, we do agree that this person may have a point here that we're agreeing with, and there may be things that we need to learn. So we're not wanting to see kind of complaints being repeated. And we're sometimes saying, actually, we agree, whereas potentially that might have been missed previously.
Just
sorry.
sorry to interrupt you, Chair. What I've just been doing a quick sum, and what it has shown to me is that they are around about in 1920 and 2021 for the, if you combine upheld and partly upheld, they are both around about the 50% mark of the total complaints received. So 27 out of the 53, and where did I put? And 12 out of the 28, no, more than that. But what I will do is that for the next year's report and or more regular reports into audit and governance, I'll put a percentage there as well. So it's clearly that you can see where that correlation is from the previous year. But to answer your question around have we done a bit more digging into that? Was there an uplift for a particular reason? Again, going back to the previous table that sets out the reasons for the complaint, that the work to correlate the performance figures around each of those outcomes. So why was it upheld? Was it about this or that action? I think there's to be more done on that. But what I'm trying to say is that in each of the green, red and amber tables, there's a bit more of a breakdown on where those numbers fall into the type and reason for the complaint. What we're really keen and trying to do for future reports is bring those tables into a more succinct way so that you can see those relationships between the reason for the complaint, the outcome of the complaint and the figures, so that you can have that better understanding rather than trying to flip between tables. Sorry, that's probably a bit of a convoluted answer.
No, that's helpful, thank you. And it sort of answered the follow-up point I was going to make in a roundabout way, so we can park that one and move on to the next section. Unless anybody else has anything on adult social care. Oh, apologies, Councillor Fenton.
I jumped the gun. I thought we were going on to the general.
We're going into the general annual corporate complaints procedure. So you can jump in first, and then Councillor Hollier.
Thank you very much. On page. Page 1551, just looking at the out of time percentages. So these are stage 1 complaints, where most of the complaints are, most of the action is. There's been a reduction in the proportion of complaints dealt with out of time from 30% in 1920 to 16% in 2021, but it's still at a very, very high level in some directorates, and children education communities, it actually went up. Just to help us get a better understanding of the nature of the out of time nature of the response, is that when you commission a response from a directorate that you don't receive the information in time, or is it that you receive the information in time, but then you don't have a lot of time to turn that around into a response to the customer? It may be a combination of both, but it'd be helpful to understand that a bit better. Thank you.
So the time period that this report covers was before the introduction and implementation of the 4 Cs, where now that the team of the complaints and feedback advisors manage and do the investigation from start to finish, including the responses. We also aligned the timescales to those best practice timescales within both the other 2 legislative complaints procedures and the information coming out from the Ombudsman. But where there hasn't been a response, or where we've recorded and shown as no response, it could be, as you rightly say, a mixture of both. It may be within under the old corporate complaints procedure, the service area has done a response but not copied in the team so that we can update our records. Where we do get to that reminder stage, we do contact the managers and or escalate to the assistant director, or corporate director, whichever is applicable, to say this is coming up for the due date. We do need a copy of the response, and we also do that after the response time has been exceeded to try and get those copies. But there will still be a very, very low number where the response potentially has gone out to the customer, they've just not copied us in. But going forward from this year onwards, because the complaints advisors are responsible for the investigation and the response, that will be, I'm not going to make a commitment to zero, but I'll make a commitment to being a low, much closer to zero. And also we are looking at upgrading the case management system in the corporate governance team by the end of this year, start of next year. And I'm looking at the categories. So all your feedback tonight is really helpful as well on those categories that you like to see and what you would like to see in future reports. And hopefully with the configuration in the settings on a new system, it's much more up to date. I can drill it down and make more specific. So no response sent at all, as opposed to no information received back from the service area in time.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Hollier next, and then I think Councillor Musson, you had your hand up, and then Councillor Rowley.
Thanks, Chair. Section 45, the table, there's a big drop in complaints in EAP, which I guess is economy in place. I was just wondering if there was a particular thing that was resolved between those 2 years, because that sort of drop from 944 overall to 299 is a sort of big percentage of the overall drop. I was wondering if there was a particular thing in that section that happened that caused 400 or 500 complaints to sort of not rematerialize. And then I had another question.
So sometimes it can be difficult to report or against a structure, especially if there's been a review and a restructure and teams have moved directorates, etc. So sometimes it's easier to look at the totals and or the drill down into each of the directorate names. There was also a lot of work done within the particularly in waste and fleet, where they were working directly with Kath and the advisors in the team to look at how we recorded the responses, the complaints, and got them through to them, and how they then managed and done their investigations in a more timely way. We also worked with them to look at recurring themes where they could identify and get the response, for want of a better expression, out to or the resolution out to the customer before it escalated into complaints. So going back earlier to when we were getting the missed service request definition, before it escalates into complaint, the service area had done a lot of work with, to ensure that they were addressing those missed service requests quicker and in more time before they escalate to a complaint. So that would be my reason for quite considerable drop.
Thank you. And just the second sort of related point, I guess how are those categories sort of decided? Is it the sort of staff member, when a complaint comes in, they say this is a lack of action complaint, or this is a sort of disagree with a policy complaint? So I sort of think if I report a pothole and it doesn't, you know, I go back in a month's time and it's not being filled in, and I send an email to the council that says, why haven't you filled in my pothole? It's, on the face of it, it's a lack of action. But actually, in the meantime, somebody will have been, looked at it, decided it didn't meet the criteria or whatever for filling, and that's why it's not been done. So in a sense, they're disagreeing with the policy, but on the face of it, you'd think they were disagreeing with the sort of lack of action. But actually, you probably want those complaints in the disagree with the policy ones, so you can sort of say, actually, there's lots of people that are complaining about this particular policy, rather than that the council's not doing something it should do, if that makes sense.
So what we do with complaints is we, particularly where we need to be doing a more in-depth response, the first thing we do is we will contact people and make sure that we've got a really clear understanding. So we will bullet point, this is what we think your complaint is, and this is what we think you want as an outcome. Please can you let us know if we've misunderstood you? So there can be times, as you say, where we might be thinking that they're telling us it's because, you know, something's not being done, when actually it turns out that they just haven't been told that something's been done and what the outcome of that is. So we work to try and understand really clearly what somebody's actually telling us and what's gone on, and to then make sure that we can answer that question really clearly. So the advisors are the people that actually categorise things based on that clarification from the customer.
Okay, Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. I have a couple of questions, so I'll start with one, and then I don't want to take the post to someone else. So we'll see if anyone else has anything to say. The first question sort of leads on from what Councillor Holly just said, actually, about lack of action as a category, notwithstanding your comment about it could be a lack of, disagreeing with the policy, but the experience that the customer has is still the same. It's not been done. And if it's gone into that category, it must be that the customer hasn't had it explained to them, if it is a policy issue, that's why it's not been done, and the experience is still the same, they still feel ignored. And I just thought it was, having seen the report last time, it's kind of discouraging that, we had 502 stage 1 complaints, and almost a third of them are lack of action from a single directorate, and that fits the pattern that we had last time. I know you've outlined some steps that you've taken, and it seems like there has been some improvement, but there's still major issues in one directorate. So do you think that's going to improve? Is there more work that you have planned with that directorate that's going to improve things, or is it not working? Because it still seems to be quite a big issue. And I have to say, a lot of the complaints or comments or whatever you want to call them that come into me are, I contacted that directorate and no one has ever got back to me. So it seems to still be a common issue.
So yeah, we've picked up the work specifically with that directorate, and Kath goes to their regular management team meetings. She's now a standing item on their management team meetings rather than asking to come along on a 6-weekly, 3-monthly basis. She is now a standing item. I then go more or less frequently, and where there may still be some disagreements on how to progress, how to make those improvements, I can go in with the more strategic, longer view and discuss with them where we have, and we really hope to see the further improvements with that directorate is from the introduction of the 4 Cs, is that we can get into the investigation in a much more timely way with the skills and experience of the advisors and with Kath, and start to work with managers in that area to find solutions. So Kath can give you an example of where that's worked really well this year. I know that's not in this year's report, but will be next year. The other thing is also to take into account for that directorate, they are the directorate that will hit every household across the whole of York at least once a week. And so they will generate a lot of more contact into the council. They're visible, much more visible than some of the other service areas. That's not to let them off the hook at all, but it's just to take that little bit of weighting, perception and understanding that they will generate a lot more contacts. And the whole point around an accessible complaints process and the hope for the 4 Cs is that we make it more accessible, and you will potentially see complaints go like this, because that's what you, if you've got a good complaints process and a good way of making it accessible to everybody, and you're not trying to look at ways to not respond, and we have a really clear process and policy in place for both staff and residents to access and use that, we will expect to see complaints kind of increase, because that's what you want. You want that free feedback, you want that free learning, and hopefully after a little while we start to see those improvements starting to make a difference. So yeah, there is ongoing work always with that directorate, and as I say, we can regularly meet with the managers in the service areas and the supervisors and others there as well.
Did you have a second question, Councillor Musson?
I did, if no one else is waiting.
I've got a couple of people waiting, but by all means, while you've got the microphone, and then it's Councillor Rowley next after you.
So I had a sort of follow-up question on the feedback loop and feeding back key themes and things to others in the council, and you mentioned CMT. And one of the things that struck me reading the report was when I got to the remedies, I think it's page 56 on the top page numbers, the amount of remedies issued that sort of have to do with housing repairs. And I just wondered if there's any feedback loop, or maybe you just assume it kind of happens because CMT feedback to members, because obviously sometimes we decide the policies or we decide the funding, and I think clearly there's a pattern in the complaints that point to us maybe not always getting around to housing repairs. So I just wondered if there's any link between, or feedback method between, aside from us reading this report here, of course, between members being able to take into account those complaints and patterns in their decisions.
So ideally, when anybody's looking to review a policy or procedure or look at funding allocations, etc., it would be helpful, not just to promote our own service areas, but it would be helpful if they do consider, and we're a great promoter of that, that you look at your complaints and feedback information and reports, so that you can do that fully rounded report to whether it be a senior management team or any of the decision makers routes that we have in the council, so that they have that full picture. And also look at getting support from myself or Kath when writing those types of reports, to say, if you do X, there may be another consequence that you may not have foreseen as a service delivery and or as a council and or as a decision maker. So please bear in mind that there might be this other implication, and please look at your previous quarter or your previous year's remedies by the Ombudsman, and also your internal, so from our investigations, what remedies that we've put in place as well. So absolutely, I would love to see that, close that loop, and we'll be doing more work with that as we go forward.
I'm just going to jump in. What Jenny was just saying to me was just pointing out that actually individual scrutiny chairs can, of course, request more detailed information on specific areas, and so the chairs that are around the table might want to think about whether there are particular areas that they'd like to look at in a little bit more detail. And just while I've got the floor, sorry, Martin, I'll bring you in 1 second. But I'd had the same thought about the amount of housing-related complaints that had gone all the way through to actually, you know, a payment coming out. And you mentioned about how the Economy in Place Directorate is such a big directorate that it touches on, you know, sort of everybody every day of the week. But obviously there's a big difference between my bin wasn't collected and my flat is mouldy and it hasn't been dealt with. When we're putting together these reports, is it possible to break down actually on this general report in a little bit more detail on Economy in Place? Because at the moment we've got these two big directorates at the council, People and Economy in Place, which account for probably, I'm guessing 3/4, if not more, of all the complaints that come in. And obviously by statute, we have to report separately on children's and adults. But it's a bit of a blurred picture when we start looking at Economy in Place as a whole, when it does such a diverse range of things. So even if we just took out and said, right, housing over here, waste services over here, and everything else that Economy in Place does, I think that would be helpful from a transparency perspective, but also from a committee perspective in terms of thinking about where we need to do a bit more learning or a bit more digging.
So absolutely, I'll take those comments and wishes for next year's report, but also into the more regular reports to audit and governance that does include complaints and all things information governance. What I'll look at as well is when we're upgrading the system, is how we can split down those categories or service areas into more of a header type theme. So not relying, because that's where we've been up till now, we've been relying on the structure. So the names of the director, the names of the teams, and it's about, you know, we can sometimes change those quite a number of times and it can be difficult to pull that together. So what the aim is on the new system is to do it under categories and service delivery type, rather than on where existing or what will be the structure within the council. So yes, hopefully.
Chair, can I just add as well, housing is one of the services that has changed, is going through change as a part of the restructure. So for a period of time during this report, it was sitting under Adults, Health and Housing Directorate, and then has moved to Economy in Place and has now got a new management structure in place as well. So just to kind of qualify it, it has moved and now got a different governance arrangement with it as well. So hopefully there could be a different comparator check with next year, this current year, for the next report.
No, that makes sense, and it's maybe presents an opportunity to just refine slightly how it's reported. So I guess that whether it's myself or Chair of Audit and Governance, perhaps if when you've got a sense of what might be possible in terms of different things, if you could perhaps come back to us with a even if it's just a quick email overview of these are the sorts of things that we can report on, I think that would be helpful. Apologies, Councillor Rowley.
Okay, Chair, thank you very much. So I just want to ask a question. It's on page 56, and it's the payments section, paragraph 49. Again, really correlating with what's just been discussed about housing. A lot of the payments that have been ordered, from the Housing Ombudsman. But my question isn't necessarily about where they're from. My question is that the total amount of payments is 8,481. We have had throughout the report comparisons of previous years. And so I have two questions. Firstly, how does that compare to previous years in terms of the amount of money that we've had to pay out? And secondly, and there's probably a very simple answer to this that I'm hoping you can give me, from what budget does that particular amount of money come from? And is that within what we expect in terms of a contingency?
So I think I would need to go back and check the comparison between previous years and come back to people with that, rather than just kind of trying to remember that off the top of my head. So yeah, we'll come back to you with that. In terms of which budget it comes from, it depends what the service area is. But generally speaking, the area that the decision is against is the area that needs to make that payment, and it just comes out of their budget.
So will that information come back at some point, Chair? Is that you'll let us have that? Yeah, thank you.
I will do. I'll get the report from last year and send you an email back out as soon as possible after today.
Yeah, it was just, I mean, you were really good in giving us past comparisons in every other section, but that one section and, costs obviously, and the cost of the council is very important. £8,500 might actually be a snip compared to what we paid out in previous years. Now, it may be way ahead, and it just would be good to know where we are with that. Thank you.
I'm sure we can get that circulated to committee.
And I've also made a note to include that comment for next year, so that I have that year-on-year comparison.
Thank you. Councillor Pearson, we weren't sure if you were indicating to ask a question or not, but I had Councillor Fenton waiting. I don't know which. Take your pick, Councillor.
I'll go first. Thank you. Just further to the point that Councillor Rowley made, in terms of the mention of housing comes in the context of the list of payments, and obviously there's an ombudsman as part of that process. Would it be possible in future years' reports to present the information relating to housing complaints in a similar manner to those for the other service area where there is an ombudsman as the final stage in the process? Maybe the changes within housing and housing's new location in terms of directorate might support that more granular reporting, and it's something that can be picked up in housing scrutiny. But I just think in terms of this report, would there be scope to treat housing complaints in a similar fashion presentationally to how you've presented the adult social care and children's?
We can certainly look at how we present the corporate style report next year. It will look and feel quite a lot different because it will be around the 4 Cs. We will have had the advantage of having hopefully a new system in place for a few months by the time we start to write this next annual report. So we should be able to pull out much more effective and comparative information around that. And as I said, hopefully I should be able to set it up so that we look at service delivery types rather than a service area name and structure within the organisation. So that housing type, the waste types of service, etc. So we can hopefully put those as a service type delivery rather than a service name. So yes.
Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. A bit left field this question, but I'm just wondering how we capture, if we capture complaints from staff members. And I'm thinking particularly, obviously, in my own industry, which is in public transport. We've seen since the pandemic a marked increase in the amount of aggressive behaviour from customers towards our staff, and I just wondered if that was a sort of phenomenon that had been seen in our own services.
So that type of a complaint made by a member of staff that they were subjected to what they felt was abusive, aggressive, or other types of violent or unacceptable behaviour from a customer. It is dealt with through an HR process, and it goes into our health and safety portal where they log it as an incident, and then working with our manager and our health and safety, depending on the nature of the incident, that is then progressed through that process. If it's a complaint regarding a member of staff's conduct and behaviour, that can and often does come through our process for login, but what we have to do is pass that on to the appropriate HR process to be dealt with in that way. And the website page now that we've updated that with the 4Cs, etc., clearly explains what can and can't be dealt with through the corporate complaint process, and one of them is allegations regarding staff conduct and where that process is for that and how they can raise that type of complaint.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. I've just got one other question on this report. It's just on page 53. Just looking at the stage 3 complaints, and I think what I'm looking for really is a bit of reassurance rather than necessarily anything else. But at stage 1, the proportion of complaints is massively economy in place, as we've already mentioned. By the time you get to stage 3, it's actually the health and adult social care that's up in, pretty much the same 50-50 almost, or in fact children's, adult and economy in place. Now, my guess would be that that's because the types of complaints that you get coming into children's and adults might be more complex and might be more prone to people wanting to pursue them, rather than necessarily say, if it is my bin wasn't collected 3 weeks running, we're very sorry, your complaint's upheld and that's now resolved. Is that a correct reading of that as to why those numbers sort of become much more even by the time we get to stage 3?
They're really different processes. So in terms of adult social care, there are no stages. It's green, amber or red that we do an assessment of. So in terms of the social care complaints, the advisors would grade that at green, amber or red. In terms of children's, there are stages, but a stage 3 is a panel with independent people. So what you're looking at, I think on page 53, is all of the corporate complaints. So within children's services, there may be things like education type related complaints that would come under there rather than social care. Obviously within adults, again, it might include things like housing as part of the directorate at that point in time. So I think if we're comparing it with the stage 3s within the adult and children's care sections, there's a difference there because they're very different procedures. If it's kind of within the directorates, and which bit of that is the corporate bit within children's and as was housing and adults, I think it's exactly as you were saying, it's sometimes about the complexities and where they go.
So just to make sure that I've got this right in my head then, so these stage 3 complaints here are the corporate complaints that are within those directorates. And so the fact that children's and adults are hugely outweighed by economy in place at the start, at stage 1 here, is because of essentially I'm trying not to say simplicity of the complaints, but essentially the simplicity of the complaints, which then means that by the time they've fed through, we've dealt with pretty much everything, and it bottoms out into these sort of few sticky, difficult, hard to deal with complaints.
So I think, yeah, your reading of those figures is mostly accurate, that by the time you have an issue within those particular service areas, the ability to progress through the stages, and or it may be, because even in the old procedure under corporate complaints, the advisors made an assessment on whether they would look at it through stage 1, 2 or 3. There was an assessment made. So if the nature and the complexity of the complaint warranted a investigation by a more senior member of staff, it would be put in it straight at stage 3. So yeah, your reading of those figures and that increase and or that levelling out between the different directorates over the stages in the old corporate process is mostly accurate, in as much as it may be that they weren't assessed to be heard at stage 1 and or 2 and or 3, because that hierarchical step, whilst there was 3 stages, it wasn't that you had to do stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. You could be assessed because of the nature and complexity of the complaint you were raising to go in at stage 3. So yes, and a short answer is yes, you're reading, and that's quite right.
Good, and I think that reassures me that it's always nice to be mostly accurate. Right, I think unless anybody else has any further questions on this agenda item, that's been really helpful. I'm not seeing anybody else, so thank you very much for your time this evening. You're very free to go, and we look forward to hearing the updates to those 1 or 2 questions and looking at the future reporting as and when. Thank you. Right, I'll move us on then to agenda item 5, which is badged as Organisational Development. We did have a little disagreement over the title of this because it was requested as a CMT restructure update, but nonetheless, the content is the same. So Janie, I think if you're able to just talk us through, I'm not sure, is this as a presentation or is it just as we have it on here?
No, there isn't a presentation from me. It is as presented on the agenda, Chair.
Okay. It's just in the papers as a presentation. It's only as I've got to it, I suddenly thought, oh, are we going to look at this on the screen? But no.
No, we're not looking at it on screen. It's just, it's easier to present it in that way, very graphically, so that you can see the structure broken down by directorate. So this is the information I've received from HR for the purposes of this evening. Are you happy for me to just give us?
Yeah.
So the committee asked for an update on the senior management restructure. This was commenced in December 2020 and largely implemented by April 2021. And there was a commitment to achieve savings, and as the report indicates, that was £80,000. The posts subject to the current recruitment and interim arrangements were recruited to, and their new structures are as detailed in the PowerPoint slides which are attached to the agenda item. The work in respect of the heads of service, which is the grades 12 and 13, is currently underway and almost completed, and that is being overseen by the Chief Operating Officer with support of HR. As you may be aware, however, there is a current recruitment exercise. So the council is seeking permission from Staffing Matters and Urgency Committee on the 18th of October to recruit to the permanent position of the Corporate Director for People. And there is a recruitment exercise underway as well, also for the Assistant Director of Children's Social Care. And both of those recruitment processes are being supported externally by Resourcing Solutions. There's currently interim arrangements in place, and so the statutory role of Director of Adult Social Services is currently being held by Michael Melvin, and the statutory role of Director of Children's Services is being held on an interim position by Anne Coyle, and she is in her 2nd week. The recruitment has taken place to backfill Michael Melvin following his appointment, so that is for the Assistant Director of Adult Social Services, and Amanda Jones will start in post on the 15th of November. Chair, I'm happy to answer questions where I can, noting that I'm not the head of HR.
No problems, and thank you. And I think it is really helpful actually to have the structures set out as they are in the report here, because it's very clear then to sort of see the lines of you know, who reports into who and what have you. The first immediate question, which I'm just going to jump ahead of anybody else and just ask, is obviously with the Corporate Director for People leaving at the same time as the Assistant Director for Children's leaving, I just want some reassurance that we're satisfied that everything is robust as it can possibly be in terms of safeguarding, particularly children's safeguarding, because obviously when there are interim positions in place, it makes people a little bit nervous just to make sure that all the procedures are being followed as they should be.
Yes, Chair, they have. Amanda Hatton leaves the authority on the 31st of October, and she has relinquished her position of statutory positions of DCS and DAS, as I've already indicated, so they are already covered. There was an overlap between Anne Coyle starting and Amanda commencing her annual leave prior to her departure, so there has been some handover, if you like, on a day-to-day basis. The posts, Michael Melvin and Anne Coyle, are currently being directly managed by the Chief Operating Officer, so there is appropriate line management in place as well.
And just in terms of the posts that they have vacated, because obviously if everybody sort of moves up one, are we satisfied that further down the chain positions are sufficiently covered or filled to make sure, like I say, just it's the day-to-day operational stuff that I'm most concerned about, just being reassured that we're still operating safely as we possibly can.
So Michael Melvin hasn't been promoted, he's just assumed the statutory responsibilities of DAS, so he remains in his current position, and the factor that has changed is his line management responsibilities, so that he's now, instead of being managed by a corporate director, is being managed directly by the Chief Operating Officer. The statutory position of DCS is now undertaken by Anne Coyle on an interim basis, pending the appointment of a corporate director for people who will then assume or reassume back the statutory roles. So Anne Coyle is a qualified social worker, she's got the experience, and she's taking on the statutory functions of ensuring that children's safeguarding is absolutely delivered, and that any challenges that may come from Ofsted for the ILAPS inspection, we are well prepared for, and she will be the point of contact for Ofsted. So I'm satisfied as the legal advisor, and the monitoring officer that the governance arrangements in place are currently appropriate for the interim period, pending the recruitment.
Thank you very much. Right, I'll open to everybody else for questions now. I just wanted to just be completely clear on that point. I think Councillor Norman was indicating, or were you just raising your eyebrows at me? I was looking for those subtle little tweaks. Any questions from anybody on anything in the report? Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Just on paragraph 5, just clarify, is the net general savings of 80k, is that a one-off or is that a recurrent saving?
Not section 151 either. I can just check with Debbie and get a correct response circulated to the members of the committee. I'm just hesitant to answer because I can't recall that far back from December and April, and it wouldn't be fair for me to comment on financial responsibility. So I will get the accurate answer from Debbie and circulate it to all members. Apologies.
Councillor Rowley.
It's a kind of a follow-on question from Councillor Fenton's, really. I mean, you know, the £80,000 saving may seem like a substantial amount of money, but actually, if you think of some of the most senior directors of the City of York Council, that's probably about half of their salary. If we're looking to recruit, it's really a follow-on question from Councillor Fenton's. You know, that £80,000 would very quickly be swallowed up, and I'm just concerned that as we look to recruit senior positions, you know, how much of that saving will be eroded by having to offer salaries that are attractive enough to recruit the right level of. I know, Janie, you won't have the answer, and I appreciate that.
So, well, I can just clarify that the salary, published salary for a corporate director at the City of York Council is 101,661 to a maximum top of scale of 112,067. And when you compare that to other DCS DAS posts, that is significantly low. As is going to be detailed to Staffing Matters and Urgency Committee, it does mean it's more challenging to appoint to that post because the salary is not of the market value for other combined DCS DAS roles or even a single DCS role. Other local authorities pay significantly more. £80,000 from memory is the salary of an assistant director, I think, but I haven't got those details in front of me. But the corporate director of people is a significantly low salary when you compare it to other councils.
Forgive me, Chair, it was more just to highlight my concern that, whilst we've made this saving, that could very quickly be eroded. And if that's an annual saving, well, then that's slightly better. But if it's just a one-off saving, then that's very quickly going to be eroded. So it was really a follow-on from Councillor Fenton's question. I understand you won't have all the answers, but thank you.
No, all I can remember and do know is that that's the comparator of the one structure compared to the new one, which was implemented in April. So the £80,000 is the comparator of that. It's not the recruitment activity based on the current structure. So the current structure is funded to a lesser amount than the previous structure was. So that is where the saving is coming in, and the appointments are only for the posts that are on the current structure.
I think as well, just for clarity, that's the corporate management structure, and then grade 12s and grade 13s that sit below that are not counted within that same figure. And I think one of the questions that I would put, although I appreciate that you're probably, again, not in a position to answer this, it's a shame that Trudy wasn't able to join us. But we do seem to have had, at the same time as we've had a reduction in corporate director posts and then a number of director posts, what we've had an awful lot of is grade 12 and 13 posts beneath that, which my understanding is that the salaries for those are counted within the directorate budgets rather than the CMT budget. And so there's a miss or a double counting of what the management structure is actually costing.
Obviously, I can't comment. I'm not the Section 151 officer with responsibility for the budget, but I'm sure I can relay these questions to Debbie and get an answer circulated to members of the committee.
As I say, I think it's just a bit frustrating that we were expecting the head of HR to present this paper. So I fear that we may end up with the same questions or the same answers to our questions. I had Councillor Hook next and then Councillor Musson.
Thank you, Chair. This probably is another one that can't be answered here at the moment, but has the new structure strengthened or impacted on the work of the council? I mean, from personal, I can see one area that has improved, but I don't know whether that's happened to all of them.
I think you could answer that question in multiples of ways, and it depends on which service. So, for example, housing has changed from being immersed within adults' health and housing. I think that has probably benefited now because there is a director with responsibility and oversight, and it is now sitting with other services which complement its function. So it ensures that service is delivered much more in combination with other place-based services rather than with health and adults-based services. So I think that has probably improved, but it's like the figures from the annual reports, it's just not coming through yet because housing's transformation into a different directorate with a new governance structure is still in its infancy, to be fair, for all performance figures. The People's Directorate one, I think there's lots of peaks and troughs in pressures, and that has been heavily impacted by COVID, by the lockdown coming, both how you deliver statutory services in a lockdown, and then you transform your service delivery to come out of lockdown and then post-lockdown. And I think that makes it very difficult. So there's lots of pressures and peaks and troughs in that entire area. And also there's a lot of third-party significant impact. So in adults, for example, there's a lot of interrelationship with the hospital, mental health teams, other NHS services, which really impact on that service delivery. So, and that now it's going through recruitment. So again, it's a bit hard to answer that. I do think other services, however, are probably benefiting on the whole. So I do think my personal view is I think overall this structure is better.
Thank you. Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. There's been one or two questions that I'm going to need to be taken away and perhaps answered via email. But just thinking that members of the public who might have heard your questions probably keen to hear the answers to. Is there any way that we could go over them on a webcast at the next meeting, just to make sure that members of the public, if they're appropriate to be heard by the public, I'm sure there's nothing untoward. I don't know, is that the best way to do it? I guess it's difficult if you hear a question and then you get heard that you can't hear the answer, and then we find out via email. It doesn't seem very transparent.
I completely agree. I think what we have done previously is append them to the minutes when the minutes are published. So that would be an option, or I'd be very happy to, at the start of the next meeting, go through any questions that were outstanding and read an answer. And I don't know whether the committee has a preference for either of those two options, but I'm happy to go with either. 6 2/3.
No preference, but it's just helpful that members of the public watching now know where that they're going to need to look. So I guess the minutes is probably helpful.
Well, I think, yeah, probably the simplest then is to append them to the minutes. And the minutes, of course, will come to the next meeting anyway, so we can draw attention to the fact that they are there appended to the minutes. And then if there's any follow-up from that, we can obviously deal with that. Okay. Councillor Pearson was next, and then I think Councillor Norman.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I was going to ask around the new directors in the People Directorate, whether that had improved resilience. I don't know if you're able to answer that kind of question, but also in your own directorate, have the changes there made much difference?
Resilience, yes, I think. I've got a social care background. For most of my career has been in the social care world, and I think there is now greater resilience for me, because there is very complementary skill sets coming in. There is oversight with having a people directorate, so it's a lot more joined up thinking and a lot more shared learning, and there's a lot more joined up communication with third parties. So for example, Jamelia coming in and focusing on commissioning, it means that she's on the management team for also children's services as well. So you're not having to repeat anything. It's about shared learning, shared responses, shared attitudes, and more responsive turnaround if we need to change services. So for me, that's what I'm seeing. Again, it's early stages because Jamelia only joined us a short while ago as well. So for that, I think it is helping. In terms of my own directorate, I've absorbed a number of services that didn't naturally sit together. So they're coming all under one umbrella of an appointment with an assistant director, which is Claire Fole. There's definitely greater resilience starting to appear in that. I also think that the services are working much closer together. There's much more joined up response now than there has been before, and there's much more of an encouragement to have a team around type of approach and work to strengths model, rather than silo working of performance says this, comms says this, climate change, however, is doing this. Now it's much more collaborative in the approach. There's a shared message, shared learning. We're also introducing making sure that it's everybody's business. So in those particular areas, it's about shared development, shared experiences, shared understanding to help improve, for example, development of the council plan, improve our strategy development, policy production, whatever it may be, comms as well. So we're much more informed globally on what is happening. So for me, I think bringing those services together is really good, and we should start seeing the outcomes of that. So that's my view so far.
Councillor Norman.
Thank you. I'm sure this has been mentioned before in conversation, but it strikes me that one of the potential issues when we look at scrutiny is obviously that the structure of scrutiny is not particularly changing, whilst the structure of the council changes, and obviously that then shifts how we as scrutiny committees deal with and who we deal with within that setting. So I think part of the kind of what I would raise as a query is that it would be useful to know that that is flagged, and knowing that, yeah, we're keeping on top of making sure that our scrutiny committees know who their directors are going to be, and who within that structure is liaising with them.
So I'll take that one to begin with, but Janie, by all means, do chip in. That's obviously been something that we've discussed at quite a lot of length in both with scrutiny chairs and vice chairs, and also in the scrutiny work planning sessions, which myself, Janie, Councillor Fenton, and usually Dawn Steele or somebody else from Democratic Services attending. I think the consensus view has been that once the Constitution has been updated, we need to have a look at the scrutiny function in terms of how it's structured and to ensure that it's fit for purpose. Because I think you're absolutely right, it was originally built up to mirror a set of directorates which don't currently exist. Likewise, I think that there is sometimes a blurring between when we are doing overview and oversight versus policy development. And I think that there are other structures which are available or other authorities use, which may or may not deliver a better caliber of scrutiny. I think you've heard me complain in this committee meeting and in private on a number of occasions about resources available to scrutiny, and I think that that is a significant issue, and I mean that both in terms of support from officers with time to actually deliver what we're asking them for, because I think an awful lot of officers are so overburdened at the moment within certain areas that it's very difficult for them to actually meaningfully engage with scrutiny, but that's then incredibly frustrating from our point of view in terms of actually trying to get access to the information that we need in order to do our job properly. So I completely agree with you that we need to take a long, hard look at the way that the scrutiny function is operating currently, but I can assure you that it is not for the want of trying.
As the monitoring officer, I would just say that there is a review of the Constitution ongoing at the moment, and all scrutiny chairs and committee members have got the option to review their terms of reference for their respective committees. The challenge was set with scrutiny chairs quite some time ago of, do you want to do this as a collective group? The directorates that it currently represents don't exist anymore. And keep mentioning housing has changed from adults, health and housing, which is no longer a directorate, into economy and place, which is now a changed remodeled directorate in itself as well. And we have a people directorate. So, and that is really for members to debate, determine and see what works. The Constitution is going to remain under review every 6 months, and the Audit and Governance Committee wants to make a fitness for purpose review on an annual basis, and therefore there will be scope to look at it and how it operates and how the new Constitution embeds. So it's not kind of, if we don't look at it now, we can never look at it again. But it is easier to do it at the start of a yearly cycle than it is midway through. So at like month 10, it's harder to change terms of reference, reporting responsibilities and it is much easier from month 1, basically, for everybody concerned. So that from practicality point of view, that's what I would say. But there is no reason why members can't review their own terms of reference for your respective committees at all to see if it reflects the work that you cover.
Okay, any further questions? No? Okay, thank you very much. I will then move us on to agenda item 6, which is an update on the work plan. Just so that members are aware, what you're seeing on pages 93, 94, 95 to 97 is essentially cut and paste from the overview scrutiny work planning document that we hold. But actually at the moment, each committee's work plan is held in separate pages and they're not always copied and pasted over to this over planning document. So one of the things that's certainly on my to-do list is to just get that updated, because actually there are 1 or 2 committees, particularly joint commission scrutinies and that sort of thing, which are not appearing here, but which actually have been in the diary for some time. And just on that note, you'll have received invites for meetings on the 25th of October. We have two proposed joint scrutinies on the 25th of October, one which is with health and ourselves, and another one which is with economy in place and ourselves. Now there's a bit of ongoing discussion in the background over what the content of those committee meetings will be, and I am trying to resolve that as quickly as I possibly can. You may note a little frustration in my voice because it has been going round and round. I don't want to air it here, but as soon as we know for certain what is going ahead, we will let you know, obviously. But if you could please hold 2 p.m. on the 25th of October and 5:30 p.m. On the 25th of October for CSMC joint commission scrutinies, and we'll be confirming that as soon as we possibly can. Councillor Pearson. Got your microphone on.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to know, and this isn't directed at anyone in particular, but just my unhappiness with the 2 p.m. meeting time. I've expressed this before. Obviously, I joined the City Council as someone with a 9-to-5 job on the proviso that I could make evening meetings, and I appreciate how difficult it must have been to have organised these meetings. So it's not directed at anyone. However, in future, I really wish that committee was consulted about if and when we can have 2 p.m. or daytime meetings, because it puts me in a difficult position as a councillor with a day job, basically.
It's obviously always a very difficult balance. I personally really hate 5:30 meetings because my 8-year-old and 12-year-old are having their tea without me again, and it's really frustrating. But it is about trying to find a balance for everybody that works, and sometimes a daytime meeting is unavoidable, but such is life. Okay, if there's no further questions on anything on that, I will draw the meeting to a close. Thank you all for your time this evening, and we will see you all either on the 25th of October or on the 1st of November, is it? 2nd of November? Whenever it is, the next meeting. 1st of November. Thank you very much.